This is the fourth part of our series on the immune system. And today I would like to talk to you about various issues that arise as a result of our immune system. These topics include transplantation of organs, and especially the rejection of transplanted organs, the occurrence of allergies, autoimmune diseases, leukemia, HIV and AIDS, and why you can get the same virus more than once. So let's get started. So when an organ is transplanted, that organ is covered in all sorts of marker proteins that the body that receives it is not going to recognize as self. And so the white blood cells are going to attack it. Now, normally this is a good thing, but in the case of a transplanted organ, this is not a good thing because the white blood cells are going to attack that organ and cause it to be rejected, which means it will cease to function and then die. So humans have thousands of different combinations of marker proteins on the surface of their cells. The fewer of these that differ between the patient and the donor, the less likely rejection is. And that's why donors and recipients have to be matched before a transplant, and why the advent of computer databases is so important in improving the effectiveness of transplantation. Even so, a transplant patient must take immune suppressor drugs for the rest of their lives. And that means that they will have a compromised immune system and so are more likely to have problems with viral and bacterial-borne illnesses. So that's the story with transplant organs and why they are so often rejected and why it's not a simple matter of just putting an organ from one person into another. So if you think about what allergies must be, it must be that the immune system is attacking antigens that are actually harmless. More than 50% of all Americans have an allergy, so this is a relatively common phenomenon. When the immune system responds to a harmless antigen, it will produce antibodies or an immune response, and this will cause inflammation when it is not needed, because in this case, the antigen is harmless, and it's the immune response that becomes a problem. In some cases, the response can be so severe that anaphylaxis will occur. And in anaphylaxis, the immune system produces so much histamine that the airways constrict and the person risks suffocation, asphyxiation. This is treated with an EpiPen, and the EpiPen delivers epinephrine, and that causes the swelling to be reduced very quickly, and the airways open back up. The most common food allergens are milk, eggs, tree nuts, peanuts, soy, wheat, fish, and shellfish. These are all high protein foods that have proteins that are going to cause your immune system, your hyperactive, vigilant immune system, to spring into action. If you think about seasonal hay fever, well, what's going on there? Pollen hits the mucous membranes in your nose. Your immune system freaks out seeing the proteins on the surface of the pollen, creates an inflammation response, and you get that whole swelling of your nasal passages, so you have to breathe through your mouth, and fluid draining out because the capillaries bed's open, and that means you're blowing your nose. Plus you get the sneeze response, which is your body trying to get rid of these hostile invaders, which turn out not to be so hostile. So your allergies are really the result of your immune system doing things that are potentially deadly in the case of food allergies to very annoying in the case of seasonal hay fever. Next, autoimmune disease. And you probably can already figure out what autoimmune disease is. If your immune system for some reason starts to attack cells in your own body, that would be an autoimmune disease. The causes of autoimmune disease are often very mysterious, but there are lots of hypotheses, and probably there is no one cause of autoimmune disease, but different autoimmune syndromes have different causes. But there are genetic hypotheses. Some cases, viruses are suspected, drugs, pharmaceutical drugs, and environmental toxins, especially synthetic, means human-made chemicals that are novel, not seen before. Examples of autoimmune disease include type 1 diabetes, in which case the white blood cells attack cells inside the pancreas and reduce the pancreas's ability to make insulin. Insulin, of course, is the hormone that regulates blood sugar. Other well-known autoimmune diseases include rheumatoid arthritis, multiple sclerosis, celiac disorder, lupus, vitiligo, and psoriasis. And you might want to look up these diseases and see what they are. You've probably heard of some of them. It'd be a good idea for you to look up 2 or 3 and just see what they are. Leukemia is cancer of the stem cells in the bone marrow, and the most common manifestation is that leukemia affects the production of white blood cells. That you can understand to be a problem. As you might suspect, there are many ways white blood cell production could be adversely affected. So there are several forms or types of leukemia, and the name is a catch-all for different diseases. However, cancer is a disease in which cell growth itself is uncontrolled. So in all cases, there is some form of lack of regulation of the growth of white blood cells. In one form, white blood cells do not mature, and this, of course, causes the immune system to go nuts because the immune system senses there are no mature white blood cells, and the bone marrow attempts to produce more white blood cells, but this is to the detriment of red blood cell production, and lack of red blood cells, called anemia, causes lack of oxygen to various parts of the body, and you understand why a lack of oxygen is dangerous to various parts of the body. Our second to last topic today is HIV and AIDS. HIV is the virus, the human immunodeficiency virus. It attacks helper T cells, and now you can understand why this is a devastating disease. Helper T cells are the centerpiece of the specific immune response, and so if you attack the helper T cells, you're attacking immunity itself. The T cells no longer can mount as an effective immune response, and they produce many copies of HIV. As more HIV is produced, helper T cells cannot be made fast enough to replace them, and their number starts to decline. And as a result, opportunistic infections, those that if the immune system were healthy would not be attacked. In other words, the ones that you have innate immunity to, the ones you're born with. So these opportunistic infections begin to occur and eventually cause the individual to succumb. You might recall that Kaposi's sarcoma is a common agent of death for people who have AIDS, and yet this is a cancer that is never seen in people with a normally functioning immune system. And so these opportunistic infections arise during late stage AIDS and eventually cause the individual to succumb. Now, AIDS, which is the acquired immune deficiency syndrome, is the set of symptoms that occur as a result of the infection with HIV. There is currently no cure for HIV. However, the most recent regimen of medicines reduces the viral load in the blood to 0. In other words, if you take your medicines properly, the virus cannot be detected in the blood. And this means that a person with HIV cannot transmit the disease. So that is really good news. Further, the life expectancy of a person who contracts HIV at 18 and uses the medication is about 65 years, which is about 10 to 12 years shorter than an uninfected person. One strange thing that researchers are still trying to figure out is that a person with HIV who is 65 looks like a person who is 75 to 80. In other words, people with HIV seem to age faster, and it's not known whether this is due to the medication or to the virus itself. And that's an area of current research. HIV virus is very labile, which means that if it's not in the bloodstream, it dies very quickly. So a person can only be infected when the virus goes from one bloodstream to the other. And the primary ways that HIV is transmitted is through sex, through mother-to-child transfers during embryogenesis, and the sharing of hypodermic needles. So those are the 3 most common ways. In the US, historically, homosexual sex has been the most common form of transmission, but in the rest of the world, it is heterosexual sex. So this is not a homosexual disease, as has been stated in the past. Here is a picture of the HIV virus. It is a retrovirus, and that means it contains an RNA strand, represented in blue here, as well as several enzymes. Here are the enzymes integrase, reverse transcriptase, and protease. You've heard of at least two of these before, reverse transcriptase and protease. It is surrounded by a plasma membrane, the phospholipid bilayer, which is right here. And you will notice that this phospholipid bilayer has many proteins in it, but it also has human marker proteins in it. And so that makes it a tricky virus to deal with. One of the reasons why HIV cannot be transmitted when it is exposed to the environment is because this membrane disintegrates very quickly and the virus basically dies or is destroyed. That's a better way to put it since it's not alive. So here is the HIV life cycle. It's a pretty complex diagram, but if you go slow, you'll figure it out. Here's the free virus. It attaches to a cell. It finds a docking protein, and then it injects its RNA into the cell. Given that HIV contains RNA, what do you think reverse transcriptase does? If you said, well, it must make a copy of the DNA, then you are correct. You give yourself a big pat on the back because that's correct. It makes a copy of the DNA that would have made that RNA. Given that HIV becomes a part of your genome, of your helper T cells, what do you think the enzyme integrase does? Well, if you said that integrase copies the HIV DNA into the genome of the helper T cells, that's excellent. You're 100% right. This gets transcribed, and then these proteins cause the immature virus to bud using cell membrane as the outer coat. Given that the HIV virus now has a single strand of protein in it, what do you think the protease does? Well, if you said it chops it up into all the proteins that are needed to make an HIV virus, then you're correct. That's exactly what it does. It chops this thing up into integrase, into reverse transcriptase, into protease, as well as other proteins in the surface of HIV, and it makes those from that one long polypeptide chain that is a result of translation. That is how HIV works, and that's a brief overview of how it causes AIDS. Let's move on to our last topic, which is how is it possible, if memory B and memory T cells are produced, how is it possible that you can get the cold or the flu each year? Well, it must be that the immune system either doesn't recognize the flu or the cold in subsequent infections, or that the antibodies produced when it does recognize it are ineffective. I don't know of any cases of the former, but I do know of cases of the latter. Either of these things might happen if the surface proteins on the virus evolve rapidly, which in certain viruses, such as the flu and the cold, seem to be the case. So let's take a look. Here is the virus as it was last year when you were originally infected. And notice that there are two types of antigens, a dominant antigen and what they call in this diagram a less common or recessive antigen. And so what your immune system did was it provides antibodies to the blue antigen. Now imagine by a year later, this year, now the dominant antigen has become the red one and the blue ones have become much less common. This means that your body will still mount a secondary immune response to the blue, but the blue now become very ineffective because they only can latch onto the virus in a few places and they can't create those tremendous clumps. And so the virus, using its new antigen, is still very successful in gaining entry to your cell. However, it takes your body about 2 weeks to catch up and produce a new immune response to this antigen, at which point it wipes out the cold or the flu again. If the virus evolves a new dominant antigen in red but maintains some of the old blue antigen, then the body responds producing the original antibodies, but these antibodies are not effective in destroying the pathogen or in mobilizing the pathogen since they don't bind to the dominant antigen, and the pathogen can continue its attack. Thus, the virus reinvades, and it takes the 2-week period before the immune system can go through its cellular and humoral response to wipe it out. And this was called antigenic original sin by the person who discovered it way back in the 70s. It refers to the religious doctrine of original sin, and I'll leave you to research that on your own to see if you can see the connection. So we're done. That's it for the immune system. I hope you understand how the immune system works non-specifically, specifically, the structure of the immune system, why humans do vaccination and how it's a brilliant technology, and then the various issues that arise in our everyday life, such as transplant organ rejection, allergies, and bigger issues like the AIDS epidemic of the 1980s, and why you can get the common cold from year to year. If you can understand all that, then you're doing a good job at understanding the immune system. Anything you can't understand, please bring to class so we can discuss it. And I'll see you next time.